Of all the games in the world, as many as there are in all their different types, varieties, shapes and styles, it's the Simpsons hit and run, its world and atmosphere that I've never been able to shake from my mind, and for reasons that might seem unlikely at first, but that I feel I've finally, after all this time, managed to pin down. I should probably start by saying it's not least of all just because it's a really good game that to this day still draws crowds whenever it's brought up. In fact, I don't think it's a stretch to say it's still widely considered to be up there as one of the most fun, rewarding and just generally iconic games of all time.
We're number one! We're number one!
Personally speaking though, and to be specific, what has always done it for me is how much of an impression everything outside of the gameplay seems to have left on me, and seemingly everyone else who has ever played this game. The depth of the world, the attention to detail, and the extent of their dedication to faithfully, fully translating background elements from 2D cells on a screen into a 3D, living, breathing universe. To use one example, it's always been evident to me in the sheer amount and variety of different playground rumours, myths, hoaxes, and urban legends that the game seems to spawn when compared to any other in existence. Sure, other games might have the one or two staples, but here, everything from supposedly secret unlockable levels, vehicles, items, costumes, hidden areas, Easter eggs, and even the inevitable misinterpreted spooky glitch or bug are just constant and never-ending to this day. Even up until a week of starting work on this video, I've heard from people who say there's a drivable Audi TT in the game, or that Avril Lavigne was a guest star to promote one of her early singles at one point. As a side note, hilariously, and making it infinitely stranger still, is that more of them than you would expect actually turn out to be true. Regardless though, and more generally speaking, my point here is just that I've always strongly believed that mysticism, all of the stories and legends that the game seems to inspire and that surrounds it like this surreal aura, surround it for a reason. And that it's the same reason behind all of the subtle underlying feelings that have stuck with me and so many others even after all this time. And they run so much deeper down in the game at an almost conceptual level. A point that ultimately inspired this. Something to finally highlight and document it all in the detail it deserves, to painstakingly lay out and explore all of the many components of the world and its bizarre seams in the fabric of its strange reality, in appreciation of an aspect of the game that I don't think has ever even been acknowledged by anyone before. The uncanny, kaleidoscopic world of the Simpsons hit and run, and all of its surreal oddities. Sure, it's nothing new or really unique for people to just want more of a good thing, looking obsessively for and playing pretend with the parts they wish existed, but at the very least, a game needs to feel deeper than it is, that there's maybe more going on under the surface, to provoke those kinds of stories in the first place. And the extent to which that's the case here is extremely telling of exactly how deep it runs. From the impressive world building to the bizarre voids left by technical and time constraints, or simply just the unavoidable side effects of translating a 2D image into a 3D universe, it's all a complex machine of components all tightly intertwined and eliciting feelings it could only elicit if it were these two exact properties in this exact configuration and implemented in this incredibly specific way. Feelings that are something truly unique and that cannot be found anywhere else in any other game in existence, making this one of the most fascinatingly deep subjects I've ever found myself in the middle of, just sitting with. And it all starts with the very idea of the game. Despite their limited involvement, The Simpsons Hit and Run is still technically not a first-party product in terms of the writing and creative staff, and so it's very self-referential at times, relying on existing jokes and callbacks to the show, contributing very little, if any, of its own material in the process. And so the game emerges from that as this kind of surreal parody of itself. Dreamlike in the sense that it relies on your obscured, blurred memories of certain moments and locations from the show. A hazy reconstruction of shapes and colours, objects and landmarks that seem familiar but that aren't exactly one-to-one replicas. Which isn't a bad thing at all, in fact it's exactly what you would want from a game like this, almost by necessity in a way. Because it's appealing to an established fanbase of those moments and locations, for one, but more importantly, the vast majority of the set pieces, jokes, and characters need to keep up with the pace of the fast, frantic gameplay. And so it can't really waste any time with long, elaborate setups or establishing jokes for later payoffs. Especially at the expense of the gameplay. It's just the side effect it has is that everything is just missing a certain level of expected depth. Feeling disconnected from the show in terms of the tone in which the references are usually presented, especially if you're really familiar with the show. And again, don't get me wrong, it's not a bad thing at all, because a game like this just wouldn't be able to work in any other way. The humour, the personality, the character is all here, but in a format that allows you to see it in an almost realistic context. To look behind the curtain, to witness any given object's place in the world way past any punchline or gag. And not that anyone would ever call The Simpsons anything close to realistic, because the show's point is to be as absurd and ridiculous as possible. But simply by virtue of being able to do this, it's at least more realistic than the show. The point there being that The Simpsons Hit and Run, to this day, is the only real way to see the Simpsons universe in this way, allowing you to put yourself in the world and explore it as if it were a real place, at your own pace and according to your own will. And so naturally, it just warrants a lot more questions as if it were a real place. Questions you're not even able to ask of the show, and in the process, it just changes its tone completely and in a way that could not possibly be any further from how it was intended. Because in 3D, you can look behind the veil, over the wall, behind the door, to see the edges of the universe, where the ground literally falls out from beneath you. And if you take that into account when you build your impression of this place, it speaks for itself. Suddenly I find myself in the centre of this madness in the truest sense of the word. A world entirely revolving around a form of frenzied mayhem and insanity. And it immediately occurs to you, it's not somewhere you'd ever actually want to be. Really. For example, whereas all of the jokes present in this game came from a show in which they were timed, set up, and framed, here they end and you're just left there to sit with them, either having just flung a cat off into the horizon, or to just watch someone's corpse gently float in irradiated waste. All this to say, and put simply, it's just different. It's The Simpsons, unmistakably, just not quite. The Uncanny Valley is an effect that relies on an object being as deceptively close to realistic as possible, so it definitely doesn't apply here, but I can't quite think of a closer comparison to the atmosphere that the art style and gameplay creates. I wouldn't quite call myself a die-hard fan, but culturally speaking, I don't think there's another show in the world that's more collectively adored and widely recognised than The Simpsons. It's always on, everywhere, all over the world, and not just TV, but food and drink, bed sheets, walls, practically everything you could possibly think of, and even some I bet you can't. The result of that just being a trained comfort around the image of The Simpsons, the shape, an association with it at some deeper subconscious level. And so when that shape is just ever so slightly off, unusual or twisted, even in a subtle way as to just be rendered by a different studio or artist. There's an inexplicable but unmistakable feeling that something just isn't quite right. Exaggerated infinitely more so in this case, considering how well established the look and style of The Simpsons is. Not to mention how difficult it is to capture any 2D image in 3D anyway. So you're left with something that gives you this feeling that it's masquerading as something you know. The Simpsons, but not. Wearing its skin, for lack of a better term. And I've always personally found that the characters especially take an unsettling charm as a result of that, moving around using canned looping animations in a way they wouldn't have if animated on the show. Obviously, needless to say really. There's an eerie marionette-like grace to them, something that always seemed to me as if they were suspended on strings. Despite the humour in maybe watching them flail around in that way. Because my point being, regardless of the reason behind them having been implemented in this way and in this style, it only really adds to this bizarre reality. Like having them be this durable, or their hyper-exaggerated features and vibrant colours, for example. In a video game format, you're given the opportunity to single out and isolate background characters that would otherwise have been reserved to simply fill in a crowd during a busy, crowded scene. Here you can make them the focus, follow them around, or simply sit back and watch their behaviours to find yet even more of the surreal workings of this world. They wander around aimlessly, but with purpose, going nowhere, either pacing forever or vanishing off into the distance. All with this empty, emotionless expression fixed permanently on their faces. I've always thought it was strange how meeting any of them in their path causes them to stop and stare completely blankly at you. Into your soul, and almost as if they're fascinated by whatever you are. As you fly past them during gameplay or simply hang around for long enough in one spot while exploring, their conversations are these snippets of strange dialogue that just leaves you with such an unsettling impression of how depressingly shallow their existence within this world is. And in that way, the pedestrians in this game, as a mechanic, only really serve to do that. To isolate you, the player, even further. Because similarly, visibly, you're very clearly the only independent, free-moving thing in this world. And so, for one, it just feels odd to play and watch from your perspective, but more importantly, you're just made to feel even more like an outcast still by just how clearly bizarre you seem to all of the world's inhabitants. In all, it might seem like a tiny aspect of the game, but if nothing else, it just takes you out of the feeling of being integrated into it, out of the feeling of being a normal part of this world, and so, more importantly, plants the seed that maybe the surface level Simpsons aesthetic, with its bright, cheerful colours and exaggerated personality, isn't necessarily what you'd imagine it to be. With all that having been said, I've debated heavily where and when to say this, and I think with that it kind of has to be now. Whenever I have these discussions, I always feel like I need to address the fact that I'm fully aware of exactly how saying and noticing these kinds of things make me look. But at the same time, I never really know what else to say. Because for as long as I can remember, I've always just spoken about and interpreted things in this way. And so obviously I've always also met a lot with the general consensus, the average person's perspective. And I get it, I may not be wrong, but this is definitely a weird, odd thing to do, don't get me wrong. But it doesn't discourage me. And never really has, because it's a way of thinking that's only ever given me more reasons to enjoy a game or piece of art. And regardless, it's always seemed to me, if absolutely nothing else, a far more interesting thought exercise to go into a game with than to simply take everything at face value. especially in a game like this. To the point where never stopping to look anywhere beneath the very surface, outside of the confines of the game's context, just feels like a depressing waste to me, when it could be so much more. Simply refusing to dismiss anything and questioning absolutely everything like this, letting every individual aspect sit with you and just really exploring how it makes you feel at a much deeper level, just gives you such a greater appreciation for every tiny component of a game. I don't doubt the fact that I could just literally be insane, or at least a little autistic, but if I ever lost this part of me, I think I'd be a much more miserable person overall. To give an honestly extreme example, the clouds off into the backdrop of every level in this game orbit the inside of the panoramic sky dome in this way because the levels are designed to be circular. Simply put, and logically, the most efficient way to create a dynamic frame where the clouds are always rolling across from one side of the screen to the other, wherever the camera happens to land, is just this. That's absolutely something I completely understand, that was the point, and there really isn't another way to do it, so it's just good game design. But if taken seriously and pretending for a second that within the context of the world we didn't know that, visually, it's obvious. You can immediately tell that it's revolving around you, made to satisfy your sense that the world is moving, that the world is real, but only so far as you're concerned. And so the rest proceeds to fall apart under the same scrutiny, into a world of examples that depict the same deceptive methods of trying desperately to convince you that you're in a real world and not a video game. Frantic attempts at trying to squash any and all suspicions you might have that it's not a real place, and to reassure you that everything is okay. And obviously, needless to say, there's no quicker way than that to make someone feel the exact opposite of that. It doesn't speak to the quality of the game at all, because obviously it is still a video game that has limitations like any other. In fact, if their attempts to hide them had been any more extreme, it would have only exaggerated the effects, for me personally at least. And not everyone can see games in this way, and that's okay, but if it's something you're able to do, then my question is, why wouldn't you? I'm just so fascinated by this subject that, as you can probably imagine, this game has been a long time coming for me. A perfect storm of exactly the kind of atmosphere and feelings that have made me so passionately vocal about this topic to begin with. And so, really, the only way to properly even start to discuss a world like this is from the top. Design-wise, as to appeal to the demographic it's targeting, the game kind of needed to come out of the gate hitting all of the common, widely associated Simpsons elements as soon as it could. And so, our first real glimpse of the actual game world comes in the form of this sweeping shot over this iconic street of all too familiar pastel houses. The third dimension immediately gives the design of the buildings this ethereal glow, with the pastel colours, the stylized windows and doors, and how they're all perfectly aligned in these eerily precise rows, something that's only really visible in this dimension. It does an amazing job at establishing such a vivid tone for the game overall, right off the bat, and I think it has a lot to do with what The Simpsons is in concept. In short, the show was originally created as a way to depict this surreal, abstract vision of the middle-class American dream. And although that's a topic that's been spoken about to death and beyond at this point, what I'm more interested in is the effect that that has on this as a game. In that the first level, in a way, kind of had to be the Suburbs to hit all those same beats. The Suburbs specifically, though, being what a lot would call the world of their mundane everyday life. Houses, parks, churches, shops, apartments, retirement homes, schools. It's another aspect that was absolutely intentional but that chemically reacts when introduced to the format of a game like this, to create something wholly unique to this experience. Put simply, it all ends up being so effective because it's easier to mentally place yourself in a scene such as this than it is any other standard fantasy or sci-fi over-the-top video game environment. It's the reality a lot of people live in, but distorted and blurred through the bizarre lens of The Simpsons. But then again distorted and blurred even further through the lens of the game and how the developers interpreted that reality. Creating this unsettling mirror, a parallel plane that reflects a lot of your own life in this twisted, upside-down way. And again, it kind of needed to be a Simpsons game for that to happen. I've always felt that a lot of the weird, disjointed feelings, though, come in large part because it's not following all of the artistic conventions or standards set by the show. At least to the same degree as the show. And that's regardless of whether or not it's because it's not realistically doable in a 3D environment, or that the devs just simply weren't as familiar with them. Because it was always going to look strange at the best of times because of that, let's be honest. But at the end of the day, that's nothing new or really unique, because it happens in virtually every case where a 2D design is translated into 3D. But here, perhaps maybe even as a symptom of how good a job the developers did at stretching out everything available to them into the 3D video game models we see here now, there's something else in addition to that. It falls into a sweet spot, a vibe I don't think would have been as effective or would have even existed if this was just some terrible licensed shovelware game that was thrown together by a less competent development studio. And I mean, not to go too off track or anything, but we do actually have quite a few examples of those, and I don't think anything could prove my point better than in how they just don't quite seem to elicit the same kind of atmosphere, despite being technically set in the same universe. Because in saying all of this, I feel like I need to keep stressing how impressive the design here is. The slight gaps or anomalies in the structure come just by virtue of it being a video game and doesn't speak to its quality at all. In fact, in all, it could not be further from lazy or thoughtless. The opposite. You'd be hard-pressed to find anywhere in this game, but specifically this level, that doesn't have some kind of secret or hidden area found by really exploring it. And it's an aspect in and of itself that gives the game as a whole that unique component. An atmosphere of there always being something more to everywhere, even when there isn't, and as I've said, especially when there isn't. Because it's in those moments when you've found a building or space that really is just that and only that, where your imagination really starts running wild. Because it's almost as if you just can't trust that there isn't more to it. That being said though, and despite it coming in large part from how well designed the game is, in all fairness, another huge part of it is just simply the fact that this is ultimately still just a video game. In that it was, at one point in time, a project limited by its scope. That being an open world driving game, essentially. But my point is, from the very beginning, it was never supposed to look and feel like that at the very least, despite being that at its very core. It goes without saying that the intention was for the game to look and feel as if it's actually a real living, breathing planet, or dimension, with no imposed video game boundaries or limits at all. As if you, the player, have actually stepped into the same reality in which the Simpsons TV show exists in, and not level 1, for example. And the better the job the developers have done in realizing that has only served to exaggerate the best aspects of the world and its atmosphere. The underlying feelings that there's more to this, something under the surface. Just around the corner, down obscured paths, roads to nowhere, in non-existent buildings and behind unopenable doors. And it feels that way in large part because it was the point. Obviously the world couldn't have gone on forever due to that not being possible, and so it backfired in the sense that the devs needed to create the sense that it does. That there's no limit, using every single conceivable method short of actually just making it go on forever. Distant 3D landscapes of rolling hills and skylines of suburban houses, narrow streets and industrial structures, all in bizarre dreamlike shapes and in a scale that doesn't make logical sense, at least in this dimension. A specific image that is forever burned into my brain, for example, is immediately visible from where you're dropped in the first level. Turning right to look down the street reveals this distant view of houses on a hill. A skyline of a suburb we're to assume stretches off well behind the horizon. It's an amazing introduction to a trend that makes up the tone of the entire game, because to be real, and in my opinion, that's not what that looks like at all in reality, let's be honest. It's just that the environment seems to play by the same cartoon rules and logic that govern the show, just in a 3D environment. A shot of a road growing smaller and smaller as it trails off into the distance. A collection of distant objects shown as simple silhouettes and shapes to represent how distance can obscure details. The issue is, in 3D, you can actually physically get closer to the horizon, meaning that the effect doesn't really work at all, at least in the way it was intended. I mean, it definitely works, if only to match the style of the show, but the moment you stop to really take in your surroundings, it falls in line to create a thread of odd, strange details that make and hold up the very world you exist in. Empty space, shallow effigies that bear the shape of something you understand, but that falls apart under even the smallest amount of scrutiny. Scrutiny that wouldn't have even been possible in any other format. From the largest examples of the scenery to even the smallest of details, like the drawn-on reflections on surfaces like windows and doors, that in an animated 2D show you wouldn't even think twice about. All this to say, ultimately it's a really visually interesting idea, but in practice it doesn't account for the atmosphere it gives a world surrounded on all sides by these deceptive illusions of depth. Fake window dressing made to give the impression of a world outside of this, but that's ultimately just a flat image, as if painted on the wall of a zoo, or the backdrop of a film set. Not to mention what the backdrop in this stage in particular even is to begin with. As a kid, one of the first things I ever did in this game was to climb to the highest point to see as far into the distance as possible. And to this day, I can't think of anything closer to compare it to than some kind of desert or barren, infinitely stretching wasteland. It's strange, weird, odd, and so when taking that into account, the game could not have possibly opened on a more appropriate level setting. This vast infrastructure of industry and commerce, a transport network, power grid, none of it real, but needing to look like it is to maintain the illusion of it being a real, living, working place. The power plant specifically is something I used to scour through, because it's easily the strangest location in the game, conceptually, with its dimly lit metallic corridors illuminated in the glow of what's presumably nuclear waste. Being reused at a later level, I found myself very early on messing around with how high I could get by stacking vehicles, and so I managed to accidentally stumble my way into the living chessboard from level 4's shortcut, way before I had any reason to actually be there. A really out-of-the-way, hard-to-reach, surreal dead end that, at least to me at this point in the game, had no context or reason to exist within the game world, other than to be that. I didn't know if I was supposed to have found this place, supposed to have gotten here when I did, and so it's always left me with this eerie feeling of having slipped out of bounds, wandering around where I shouldn't be. A perfect example of an area in the game that does in fact have more to it, under the surface, that something can be unlocked or found here, but that at this point in the game is just out of reach, only leaving you with this empty feeling that you're missing something. And that's only really my favourite example, because spots like this are everywhere, and it's especially telling of the game's vibe as a whole when you consider the fact that you don't even really need to go out of your way to stumble into places like this. One that's stuck with me even to this day is simply just what's supposed to be a swimming pool, tucked over a fence and down a narrow driveway of one of the mansions. but it doesn't quite pass for me, and never really has done. The specific image and memory of finding this place for the first time has left such an impression on me just because of how drastically it sticks out. How vividly different it is in comparison to the look and style of everything around it, as if to be something else, as if to be anything. All glowing and starkly realistic, at least relatively next to the cartoon roads and houses that surround it, like a portal or window. The reality is that it's likely just an overlooked component of the game world because it was too far out and hidden to be considered a priority, but the point I'm trying to make is that it doesn't matter. If you find this here like this, it doesn't change the feelings or atmosphere it elicits. It's strange, and moments like these are really everywhere. I'm not sure if anyone else remembers having heard this, but there was a rumour going around at the time that the gun from the episode The Cartridge Family could be found at the very top of the school. Of all places. And because the rooftops on either side were accessible, I had no reason to ever doubt that you couldn't at least get up there. Not that I ever really expected a gun to be up there. Don't get me wrong, it also helps that I'm very gullible and eager to prove things like this to myself anyway, but regardless, I have spent an embarrassing amount of my life trying every conceivable method there is to try and reach it. From stacking cars to making the jump in the rocket car, and even trying to clip through the geometry. To jump ahead a little, nothing worked, and it took me many years later to learn how to use hacks to find that there was literally nothing up there, but that you weren't really even intended to get there anyway. Something I had suspected for a long time, to be fair. But I feel it's a perfect anecdote that shows that the game inspires these kinds of legends and rumours through a combination of its environment design and source material. For one, there's a physical space in the game world that encourages it, strange, bizarre structures and geometry, voids in the level design, and secondly, a rich backlog of established jokes and references to pull from, to expect to see here at least somewhere. And ultimately, I guess what I'm trying to say is, despite my point here maybe sounding really strange to the vast majority of people, that this world's atmosphere and vibe could exist within a Simpsons game of all things. My point is, it kind of had to be one to elicit these kinds of surreal, dreamlike feelings in the first place. That it feels this way because it's a Simpsons game, and not in spite of it being one. The surreal nature of the game takes a somehow even stranger turn still when for level 2 you're catapulted into the heart of what it tries to present as the centre of its world. Essentially the in-universe city centre, named in the game as Downtown, and where the familiar Springfield setting is skewed into this chaotic dreamscape, all built up, populated and bustling with movement and life, or at least it tries its very best to seem that way. There's definitely an energy to sprawling cityscapes in games that has always appealed to me more than any other setting. And my whole life, this level in particular has always immediately sprung to mind as one of the best examples of that whenever I find myself discussing this topic, which just so happens to be a lot. Put simply, it's because cities like this are a theme that tend to make or break so many games when it comes to the atmosphere and feelings I've been discussing so far. In large part because they're by far the hardest setting to accurately capture in any medium, but especially digitally in a 3D space like this. Because they're just so human and alive, the two most difficult things to synthesize, to fake. Because people just have such an intrinsic instinct when it comes to recognizing something that isn't truly living. They can tell when it's dead. Obviously, it depends a lot on how well they go about it, or even if they're capable of capturing the atmosphere of a city to begin with, but I think the very simple fact of just how much is going on, and the very real technological limitations of the hardware they're working on, is what leads to so many of these environments ultimately seeming dead. Eerily still, empty and vacant, especially when compared to what they're trying to convey. And so, as you can probably imagine, getting here for the first time was captivating for me, in the sense that it was exactly the kind of things I play games for to begin with. It was everything I wanted from a game like this, which is also probably why I've spent more time here than in any other level. The level where all of the feelings I've mentioned so far peak in this uncanny dream of twisted lines and distorted shapes that comprise the vast interconnected streets and knotted highway systems of this world. Moving away from the familiar sets and locations of the previous stage, the levels that take place downtown feature what I've always thought were more props and physical objects in place of them. The references bring what I think are more deeper cuts. You wouldn't be able to navigate this place using your knowledge of the show in the same way that you might have been able to in the first level, for example. And just because of that, I've always thought that from this level onwards, the game took greater strides into the obscure, meaning that just by virtue of that, the likelihood that it includes something that's lost on you is a lot greater. And I mean, that's by design and absolutely understandable, don't get me wrong. If you've gotten this far, it's likely either because you're a bigger Simpsons fan than most, or that you simply enjoyed the gameplay loop of the first level to have progressed onto the second. Both cases ultimately meaning there's just more for you here than there maybe was in the surface level content and easy tutorial missions of the first level. However, that also means there's gonna be a lot more that alienates you, personally speaking at least, and if nothing else. Because I know it's entirely dependent on the person and could in theory happen on any level, but just speaking for myself, over the years I've found a lot of the references here seem to completely fly over my head, and some to this day that I still can't claim to understand. Mark Glenn and Tom's groceries and subsequent pizzerias and hotels, for example, the cracked clock towers, the hidden giant Play-Doh machine, and many more, are all things I just accept are from episodes I either haven't seen or am just failing to remember right now. But my point being, without the context of the episode, these things are just strange oddities to find in a world like this. Surreal aspects to arrive upon and to try and contextualize yourself, because it places more weight on your own imagination. It forces your mind to run, to come up with a concept or meaning for it all yourself, which obviously only leaves more room for certain bizarre leaps in logic. And as we get later into the game, it only gets more and more common. Don't get me wrong, it's one of the smaller and largely irrelevant components of the game's atmosphere, but it's definitely worth mentioning because over the years it's painted my experience in this world with feelings of just being lost or out of place. As if I'm not in on a joke that's happening somewhere, or that it's a piece of lost, incomprehensible media scrawled on the wall of a tomb in some ancient language. Similarly though, a lesser known or even acknowledged mechanic that grows more apparent as you progress deeper into the game is that the story essentially takes place over the course of a single day or so. Meaning that the first level's bright, exaggerated pastel hues and ethereal glow they all illuminate everything in is really the only time the game ever looks like that. And so it sets itself up to veer so jarringly into every subsequent level. Because as night falls over the game world, the vibrant colours gradually flatten out, slowly introducing colder blues and greys. Ominous flickering streetlights and golden glows of distant apartment building windows, adding so much life to the world, both in and out of sight. The warmer tones sink lower and lower in the sky with each consecutive level, gradually replacing them with this blanket of stars. It's iconic, and I've always loved how the game really does seem to slow down tonally as it slips into darkness, despite the actual gameplay doing the complete opposite. But maybe that was an intentional contrast. The sound is a perfect example of that, full of birds and life, the distant whooshing of passing traffic before moving into crickets and deafening silence. It's something that the game does really well, and it absolutely contributes a huge amount to its disjointed liminal feeling that's present in practically every spot in the game, but especially in this level. A strange amount of effort was given to having the daytime bird songs and traffic slowly transition into the nighttime soundscape of the later levels. I've always loved, for example, how the crickets are only actually audible in the parks and near hedgerows. It gives the world so much more life and depth than it would have had otherwise. It just makes the level feel so much more dynamic, that it's moving around you, whether you're in it or not, and even regardless of whether or not you're even looking. And there's so many other smaller details that I couldn't even possibly mention them all, like the signs and movie screenings changing every time the level is loaded, or even in the seemingly smallest, most simple things like the pigeons around the town square. Very real effort, care and consideration was put into this, into everything, a lot of it going criminally unnoticed by people, and I've always strongly believed that the root cause of this strange atmosphere comes almost entirely from that. And if not, then at least the majority of it. Just how extremely well done the game is, reacting to the very natural limitations of digital game worlds. My favourite example of that by far being how you can just be on a completely empty, abandoned stretch of road, an inaccessible rooftop or park way off in the corner of the map, and yet still hear this soundscape of constantly passing traffic off into the distance. Maybe it's just me, but it's something that leaves me with such an eerie feeling when there isn't any traffic, when there can't be, and even when there is, because there's never enough to justify it. In this level anyway. I get that the sound exists to exaggerate the scale of the city, and that I'm being pedantic, don't get me wrong. But because of the extensive detail in every other area, as I've mentioned, I have to wonder why the far-off echoes from non-existent ghost cars forever passing just through earshot but never into view wasn't made to be one of the priorities along with the other details. And so my brain just can't seem to dismiss it as an irrelevant tiny detail. And how it all works together with the actual physical design and layout of the stage is something that I've always thought was one of the most fascinating concepts to just imagine. It's really deceptively simple once you get the hang of it, but it's deceptive in the sense that it was built to seem incomprehensibly complex, but isn't in actual practice. The map the level takes place in essentially consists of 4 segments that separate different zones into different districts. You've got the town square, the commercial, industrial, and the more poorer run-down areas, but the top right of the whole level is dedicated solely to being this convoluted, vast system of intertwined over, under, and through passes. It's a kind of mega structure in itself, and initially when arriving at this place for the first time, it's all daunting and doesn't quite seem to make any sense at all, at least straight away, but that was absolutely the point, and it's kind of genius in that sense. Because it was all done to give the impression that this cityscape is impossibly huge, with roads that lead to twists and turns in a ridiculous number of directions and in a way that's purposefully as confusing as possible, that the scale is something that could only exist within a surreal reality-bent dream world such as this. Which, obviously, is exactly the atmosphere it ends up lending the game. This intimidating, impossibly grand, sprawling and imposing landscape that at least seems impossible to comprehend. And they try to emphasize that as much as possible by having it all suspended off the ground in as many loops and knots as possible, all encircling various skyrise buildings for scale. I've always loved the fact that if you can get into a spot where you can see the ground, they've used a flat texture of a city from a bird's eye perspective, which is just really unrealistically ambitious for an overpass for a start, but because it's a flat image of a city, ultimately, it was always going to end up looking like one, in a strange way. And again, like some of the other components of the world I've mentioned, it just doesn't really work for me visually. As if this part of the map takes place in a room, carpeted with one of those cityscape playmats you find in preschools. And almost entirely because of that, there's just something about it that makes me feel this sort of dreamy nostalgia. The same feelings I get through the blurry memories I have of seeing them as an infant. So it's not all intentional, don't get me wrong, but it's an unintentional aspect that chemically reacts when placed next to everything else. And so I can't help but feel like it encourages you to look at everything else with the same perspective and mindset. And in all, I feel that downtown has some of the most underappreciated areas in the entire game because of that. And to this day, despite being the part of the game that I feel I've spent the most time in, I'm still finding little spots and areas everywhere that elicit the exact same atmosphere. Because I also think that it's the level from the game with the least amount of space that's actually used in terms of the missions and story, relative to the other levels at least. And depending on how you see it and for whatever reason, more of it seems either run down, destroyed or under construction than isn't. It's a really odd decision, and regardless of the fact that some areas might have an in-universe explanation as to why they look like they do, others don't. In fact, the majority don't. And so I tend to find that the wider general impression that the level leaves on me is one of this almost apocalyptic dystopian city, with these craters in the road, the boarded up and abandoned buildings in the commercial district, all of the construction sites, half-built sky-rise buildings, and the blocked-off roads with the burning derelict cars. It's a bizarre choice that I can't claim to understand, but one that so vividly contrasts the previous level in every way possible, and so it stands out in my mind as that. As the sun sets over the game, sadly so does the extent of the locations the various levels take place in, because there's essentially only really 3 real distinct settings in the game. They're just reused at gradually later and later times of the day as you get further and further through the story. The third and final being the beachfront, seen first here during sunset, and easily up there as one of the most surreal, dreamy sunsets I've ever seen in a video game. There isn't a single asset anywhere in this stage that hasn't been run through this warmly coloured, scorched golden filter, baked by one of the most ominously massive suns I've ever seen, on its almost apocalyptic descent below the horizon, as if there's just something final and permanent about it. That having been said though, there's a strange specific feeling in particular about this place that I've always thought strangely contradicted that. Because through all of that, the level takes on an eerily relaxed tone, laid back to the extent where everything at least feels stuck in time, frozen, either on loop or literally in terms of the sun or time of day. Maybe it's just me, but in general, games that are set at such specific times as this, either sunset, twilight, or even in just some kind of perpetual weather situation, all tend to emit the same atmosphere for me. But here there's just something different about it that exaggerates the feeling to an extreme. The simple fact that you could quite literally sit here forever and it's never going to move past this point, progress, is a feeling that seems unnatural to me, especially so considering how much the time of day colours the environment here, because you're reminded of it everywhere you look. In the dim lights of the buildings, the reflections of the sky's evening glow, the never-ending perpetual movements of the clouds, traffic, waves, it doesn't feel right. And it's not an overt feeling, it more so sits in the back of your mind. Especially so considering that you do actually come back to this setting for a later level that is set at night. So you know it exists, just not here. At risk of repeating myself again, I think it's a visual effect that, yet again, is just something else that the source material lends to the experience in this medium. And it might sound odd, but it feels strange to me that I'll never be able to tear my association from these images away from The Simpsons to know how it might feel had I experienced this game in a vacuum. Because another consequence of these still 2D frames from the show being given this level of depth, the stage consisting in large part entirely of locations that were all at one point in time backdrops or some form of background scenery, it naturally leads to them retaining some of the feelings that the format they were designed for originally intended them to have. And what I mean by that is that the format is always taken into consideration whenever anything like this is put together. So the scenery here was all made to be seen from a particular angle in a 2D context. Both maybe to show off a certain side of it, but also, and more importantly, to hide others. And so, I can't really articulate it any better than that, but there's a strange, nonsensical feeling to a lot of the locations and objects in this level that comes from that. And it just leaves everything feeling subtly out of place in that regard, as if they were just put anywhere, wherever they happen to fall. I get the same vibe from most video game and 3D adaptations, to be fair, but I think just as a result of how ingrained these images and objects are, it's something unique that I don't think has ever been done anywhere else before. Partially, and as a result of all of that together though, and to be completely honest, it just so happens to be around this point in the game that I start to lose interest in the actual game during replays. Not while exploring it like this, don't get me wrong, but just in terms of the gameplay, story, and side missions. And it could be because of the difficulty spike around this point, or the fact that it's the last of the 3 levels, but I've always chosen to believe it was more because of how the game slows down tonally at this point, and in terms of the environment and setting, because it's legitimately calming in such a bizarre way. The general aesthetic of the beach theme and the buildings on the boardwalk, the tiki Hawaiian island-styled architecture, with the sprawling mountainscapes and megastructures of the dams and bridges, it serves to depict the coast of Springfield as well as some of the more scenic outskirts. So naturally, the setting alone adds to this atmosphere of a kind of dreamy, idyllic vacation spot, if only as an assumption of their intention. Because regardless, for me, it conjures the same, almost impossibly ideal, laid-back, relaxed feelings that almost transcend that of the first level's Suburb, despite maybe not being as relatable, contributing to this feeling that you're wandering this dreamscape where your subconscious mind is weirdly at ease in the same sleepy, dreary, hazy sense. The carnival elements with the twisted, detuned funhouse circus music, the towering cliffs and sudden drop-offs with parts of it, like level 2, seeming destroyed or abandoned. The bridge specifically being the biggest example of that. It could be another reference I'm missing, but it's such a strange addition to the layout of the map because it looms over so much, and draws attention to itself only to create this skyline of some kind of post-apocalypse. And strangely, that goes for the geography itself, just in general. It's a labyrinth of sharp turns and dead ends on roads that aren't roads and through routes that don't always make sense. No doubt because, in an attempt to smash together elements of the beach, the film studios, the urban areas and the outskirts, there's so little physical distance between them. Between areas that in reality would need considerable distance between them. So much so that it's very clearly the reason behind why a lot of the compromises needed to be taken in its design in the first place. Compromises that result in the map being this tightly wound little diorama of as much as physically possible in as little space as physically possible. And for better or for worse, and at the expense of the functionality. Despite that though, and as I've said countless times already, it's not a bad thing at all. It just means you'll see, for example, roads through built-up commercial districts just end out of nowhere, becoming the boardwalk. The film studios back out onto a sheer cliff face, the mountaintop observatory down the road from the dam. Having all of these assets from the show and then needing to draw physical lines between them to make them work in a world like this isn't a job that I envy at all. But just by virtue of that being a necessary part of the process of building something like this, it's a really visually fascinating sight that you will only ever get in something like this. Because it all essentially creates this essence of a concentrated world with this frantic, almost schizophrenic placement of objects and buildings, characters and vehicles, making the game feel like it takes place entirely within this hectic, over-imaginative dimension. Because like the other stages, in general, it just gives you such a lasting, strong, vivid impression. An impression that almost as if it was designed in the overactive imagination of a child. Which I think perfectly describes the style of The Simpsons when it's at its best. But here especially so, because it's a video game. And to foreshadow something I'll be bringing up later, what are video games if not a digital playground for the gameplay to take place within? And here, for the first time, really, you're able to just sit with that. Take in what that means for a world to be built in that way. And that absolutely goes for the whole game, wherever you happen to be inside of it. The roads, the cars and pedestrians, for example, by design all make up your surroundings because they're the motion, the lifeblood and energy of this world. But watching the roads for long enough, specifically the logistical decisions behind how it functions as a network, its lanes, intersections, ramps, highways, how lanes filter into each other and intersections join opposing one-way streets, how the only method of reaching certain nearby places is to take the most insane roundabout route possible through car parks, alleyways and into opposing neighborhoods, you very quickly, almost immediately, realize it doesn't just not make any logical sense, but it also doesn't work at all. Because if you decide you want to just stop and watch, you can see it in actual practice. Cars will stop at intersections and become permanently frozen in time, unable to move because there's only one direction they can go in and it's a single one-way street. Roads everywhere will just lead in circles and ultimately go nowhere, or simply the fact that a lot of roads just end at completely random and indistinct points in them, as if they have a dead end that just isn't visible, with NPCs visibly trying to accelerate forward, but the world just not letting them. Cars everywhere will just merge at once and collide with each other, creating standstills and pile-ups that permanently halt the movement of traffic in the entire level. And it's not even a rare occurrence. All it takes is for you to stand anywhere long enough for two cars to make a turn, which is obviously longer than the developers thought you might be watching this for. All this having been said though, no matter how hard I try, these are all things that I just can't seem to fault the game for. Because again, I cannot get enough of the atmosphere it lends the world. As if these are all things that just aren't important in the childlike mind in which all of this was conceived. Aspects like the logistics of a working road system are just simply of no concern whatsoever, and so they're neglected in a way that only works to exaggerate this really fascinating hollow world. Somewhat sadly though, like every point I've been making in this video, these are all aspects the developers would likely have changed if given the time and budget. And so I still think it's worth saying though that it's something that might not have stood out this way if it wasn't for how overall competently designed and fleshed out the game world is otherwise. Because this way, and if nothing else, it works to paint the world in this bizarre light, again as if little thought was given to the function of its components, past what's needed to simply look like it's working. And I think the reason that all means so much to me is because it gives me yet another context to go into the game with. One where I'm exploring it to test the inner workings. instead of just going along for the ride and enjoying the aspects that the story or source material brings with it. And one, that means that you're engaging with the game on a deeper level than you would have otherwise, a more imaginative level past what's even really there. But more importantly, it's a way that's always just going to leave such a stronger, lasting impression on you than it would have even if it was possible to create something fully fleshed out and working as if it was a real, actual world. Despite it just being the Suburbs again, what would this even be if I didn't at least mention Level 7, the game's grand finale? Well, to be completely honest, it'd probably be better off. Like everything I've said at this point, I think I need to make it clear before I say anything else that this is hands down one of the best levels from any game I have ever played, and it's easily one of my favourites of all time. The sheer passion, dedication, and love of the source material on display in absolutely every inch of this place is honestly unprecedented even by today's standards, but I'd say especially by today's standards, because I don't think I've ever seen anyone just genuinely care about anything as much as they had to in order to put something like this together. And it's truly magical in a really inexplicable way. It's as if it all just shines through in the finished product like nothing I've ever seen before, to the point where it's almost overwhelming. You just feel it. It's hard to put into words. And I really do honestly believe you just can't pay people for this level of effort. They need to have a passion for it, which is very rare in games, especially nowadays. But as evident by this, it can and does happen. And so, with that having been said, I debated heavily even mentioning this part of the game at all, because I feel it muddies my point to the extent in which it's easier to just not bring up than it is to explain why I feel the atmosphere here isn't quite the same thing as I've been praising up until this point. In the end, I've just decided to use the level to discuss the most common issue I have by far whenever I try to express anything like this. And it comes in large part from why a bizarre, surreal, dreamlike digital world like this one, and that has been the point of this video, isn't in any way at all amplified or made stronger by the introduction of horror or spooky elements like these. Because it's just not, in my opinion. And I think I know why. Because despite the level being exactly that, the game's take on a treehouse of horror or Halloween themed world for the grand finale, it's not necessarily trying to be scary as much as it's just a spooky coat of paint for the existing mechanics established much earlier in the game. More so a new costume that it's appropriating than it is any kind of deeper statement about the mechanics or workings of the gameplay in this specific part of the game, which again I've chosen to ignore for this video anyway. The justification or excuse for it looking like this is that it takes place during a kind of pseudo-zombie apocalypse. But just generally there's giant spiders, witches, ghosts, and all of the other obligatory Halloween associated decoration. In fact, there is quite literally not a single box that the level doesn't tick in that respect. And so, in general, I personally find it doesn't quite elicit the same subtle, unsettlingly ideal feelings that the other levels do. Don't get me wrong, the atmosphere is still absolutely here and as strong as ever, but whereas in the other stages greater, more drastic efforts were taken to obscure the aspects and limitations that naturally come from something being a video game, it feels to me as if those aspects would work in its favour here. And again, I'm fully aware of how that might sound like a tantrum coming from me, as if it just isn't the same if the game wants me to feel that way. I just don't think it's hard to believe at all that something like that would worsen a world such as this. One that relies so heavily on a distrust in what the game is telling you. A suspicion that you're being deceived by the bright, colourful, unrealistically ideal world. So obviously, in losing the bright, colourful, ideal components, it wasn't going to be able to maintain that same vibe. at least to the same degree. So I still absolutely think it's the case that when a game tries too hard, it can have the opposite effect. In so many other cases too, but it especially applies here. It's without a doubt intentional, don't get me wrong, which goes without saying really, but how overtly it's trying to look like an almost low-budget Halloween film set, or a cheap haunted house as opposed to anything actually dark or morbid, means that the unintentionally cheaper aspects of the game seem to fall in line with the intentional ones. So they all just make so much more sense with that added context. I just think it's kind of unfortunate in a way that the atmosphere of the bizarre voids in the cheaper parts of the game just so happen to be my favourite aspects of the game, and what this entire video was about. Because, for example, whereas in the other levels, picking up on certain areas of the world make it feel like you're peeking over the curtain, seeing something you're not supposed to be seeing. Like the static window dressing, the dome shape of the world you're enclosed within, or even just the mindless actions of the NPCs themselves. Even if it's only all subconscious, it all just makes so much more sense in a world so heavily draped in that as an intentional concept anyway. The spiders are supposed to look like they're on strings. The witch in the sky is supposed to encircle the level. And all of the NPCs are actual, literal, mindless zombies, just to name a few. So it's just not the strongest part of the game for me personally, unfortunately. Again, despite it being one of my favourite levels of all time. And I think in all that just goes to show how much the game has achieved. The range. And how the only way to really appreciate it is to break it down like this. To look at absolutely every single one of its tiny individual components in this way. And so, in conclusion, and to wrap this up in a way that I hope will tie it all together into the grander point I'm trying to make, fascinatingly, and with all that having been said, I've always loved how that, if nothing else, the final level serves to perfectly frame my perspective on these feelings, but more specifically how they influence the atmosphere at a deeper level than should be possible. In theory. A long time ago, I used to think that to enjoy a game it first needed something from you. A certain amount of effort on your part. To at least sit down, concentrate, and to be open to the possibility that you might actually like at least some part of it. But more recently, over time, I've come to learn that with that same effort you can enjoy literally any game you want to the extent in which not enjoying a game is almost a skill issue. And if it's a choice, then why would I ever choose to not enjoy something? And I just really think there's something very real to be said there, about how games start to transcend their digital confines when you look at things from outside what is perceived to be the intention or point of them. Because they can, quite easily, be more than that. If you were to only just shift your focus ever so slightly, and start to interact with them on an almost personal level. Exploring parts of them for yourself, outside of the urgency of any kind of story or context. Much like sport, video games in general can be broken down and defined as a sequence of rules and boundaries for you to play within. A stage, or field, that the developers have constructed for the game to take place in and on. But only with video games can we operate outside of them, in a way and with components that weren't intended to be on that stage, or within those confines. And I just think there's so much more value there. So much more to see. Especially so considering that a lot of the areas and locations discussed in this video were unintentionally overlooked on the developers' part. And so you have to wonder, if it was missed by playtesters, am I the first to be looking over this wall? To be standing here, noticing this? In a game this popular, almost certainly not. It's just that the feeling, if only a passing thought, is one of this lonely, isolating idea that you're actually treading new ground. On your own. Exploring truly undiscovered aspects that the developers likely weren't even aware of. But more importantly, most likely are unable to even see by the very nature of having created this as something else in the first place. Small pockets, oddities in the world, rabbit holes in the very fabric of its universe. It's amazing and something I will never be able to get enough of, wherever it is and no matter the game. Even one as seemingly unlikely as The Simpsons Hit and Run.